Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in from the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So today's episode has been a really long time in the making because today's episode's about the one deck that I finally got right. Now, I truly believe that there's no such thing as the final form of a Commander deck. New cards might come out and you're gonna make adjustments, or maybe even an old card shows up that you didn't think of before that, you know what, could make a big impact in the deck. Regardless, after a ton of different versions of this deck and adjustments and playing with it a lot to try to find the right combination of cards, I finally think that it's at a good spot to share. Now, you might be somewhat familiar with this deck concept because I've talked about it on a couple of episodes, and the first episode that I brought it up in was the episode titled The Deck I Can't Get Right. Essentially, the concept of this deck is somewhat of a Lord's Tribal deck, I would say, where every creature type matters. So obviously when a card like Maskwood Nexus came out, I made an additional episode talking about if this was the final piece to my dream deck. Now, if you haven't seen these episodes, or you're not sure exactly what this concept is, or even what Maskwood Nexus does, that's okay, because we're gonna jump into it to find out. So, like I mentioned before, Maskwood Nexus is kind of like the perfect card to illustrate what this deck is all about. It's an artifact for 4 and it says creatures you control are every creature type. The same is true for creature spells you control and creature cards you own that aren't on the battlefield. Basically, every creature you have is every creature type no matter where they're at. It also has a nice additional ability, pay 3 and tap it, create a 2/2 blue shapeshifter creature token with Changeling. And of course, creatures that have Changeling are every creature type. So that is powerful and nice to have, but I just want to reiterate that the important part here is that first part. Essentially, this makes all of our creatures changelings. And in all actuality, this probably should be the golden pig of the deck. When Kaldheim came out and this card was spoiled, I made quite a few adjustments to my deck to try to make this the key piece in the deck. But after a lot of different versions and playtesting of this deck, I found that this deck actually really wanted to work around a different card. Now, we'll get to that card here in a minute, but basically, the other version of this card is kind of weaker than this one is. Now, don't get me wrong, it's still incredibly effective and does pretty much exactly what we want it to do, it's just somewhat of a lesser version. But the main reason that that card is the golden pig of this deck and not this one is because of the commander that I selected for this deck. Now, I went back and forth on a few different commanders, again with the different versions of this deck, but the one that I have now landed on is General Tazri. General Tazri is a 3/4 human ally for 4 and a white. She has, when she enters the battlefield, you may search your library for an ally creature card, reveal it, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. And then by paying Wooburg, ally creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X the number of colors among those creatures. Now that second part is nice, it can actually help us win the game, but we'll get to that here in a bit. But the important part about that second part is that this is a 5-color commander, so it gives us access to every single card that we need. For a Lord-style deck like this one, having access to every single color is very much needed. On top of this being a 5-color commander, the main reason that this commander was chosen is because of that ETB. Tazri is essentially a tutor for any ally that we want. And this deck revolves around a very specific ally. And that would be the golden pig of this deck, which is the #1 card out of our 99. And the golden pig of this deck is, of course, Mere Entity. Mere Entity is a 1/1 shapeshifter with Changeling, so technically it's an ally because, yeah, it's every creature type no matter where it is. It costs 2 and a white, and it says, pay X until end of turn, creatures you control have base powered toughness XX and gain all creature types. So Mere Entity can essentially turn all of our creatures into changelings. Giving all of our creatures every single creature type is exactly what we want this deck to do. Now, unlike Maskwood Nexus, this doesn't impact creatures in our library, which would have been really nice and very impactful if that was the case, but still, this is an incredible card in this deck, and the fact that our commander can tutor it up is huge. Now, its ability to change base power and toughness in the X activation can definitely be an upside, and it can also be a downside too. The upside is, well, we can make our creatures huge if we really want to. If we've got a good amount of mana to dump into this, we can make them all really big and, smack our opponents in the face. But the downside to this, however, is that Maskwood Nexus is just active all the time. Our creatures are all creature types no matter what, and with this one, we have to actually activate that, and most of the time, we do have to pay at least 1 mana to do that. I guess I should say we could pay 0 mana if we want, but our creatures are going to die unless we've got some other way to prevent them from dying, and we'll talk about ways to do that here in a bit. Regardless, yes, Mirror Entity is the golden pick of this deck because it is the key piece to this deck that we can tutor up consistently with our commander. Now, does that mean that I wouldn't rather have Maskwood Nexus in play? No, I probably would rather have Maskwood Nexus in play, but the more and more that I playtested this deck, the more that it worked, with Mirror Entity being the key tutor piece, and Maskwood Nexus just being a nice card to sometimes get in your hand and play. Regardless, how exactly does this Lord's Tribal deck work? Well, let's jump into things to find out, and to start, let's start off with some ramp cards. Now, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but I'm bringing it up now, so since this is a pet deck of mine, I have been trying to make adjustments here and there, and I've been making adjustments with cards from my own collection. So essentially, unlike a lot of my other personal decks, I didn't just finalize a budget deck list and buy that. So I'm most definitely utilizing cards in this deck that were budget at one point, but might not be anymore. So of course, with all that said, first up, there's Wayfarer's Bauble, and yeah, that felt really good to say. For those of you that don't know, Wayfarer's Bauble is an artifact that costs 1, you pay 2 and tap to sacrifice it, and you get a basic land into play tapped. And even with its recent reprint in one of the Forgotten Realms Commander decks, this card is still $2.68. So again, for most of my budget decks, this still would unfortunately not make the cut, but again, this is my pet deck, so I've made some exceptions for cards that I already own. Regardless, another great turn 1 play comes with Search for Tomorrow, which has to spend 2 for a green, and it's going to get us a basic land into play untapped. This is a fantastic way to invest mana early to ramp later, and yeah, to set ourselves up for success. Speaking of which, we've got some creatures that can help us ramp as well with Sakura Tribe Elder and Diligent Farmhand. By sacrificing Sakura Tribe Elder, we get a basic land into play tapped, and we can do the exact same with Diligent Farmhand, but we've got to pay 1 and a green to do so. Regardless, these are fantastic creatures to get down early to ramp us, and later in the game we can actually just utilize them as creatures. With this deck, the more bodies that we have on the field, the better, no matter what creature type they are or kind of what they do to a certain point. Though they might not seem like much as just 1/1s, still they can make a huge impact on the game, and we'll talk about why here in a bit. Regardless, next up we've got some 3 mana ramp spells with Cultivate, Springbloom Druid, and Harrow. Cultivate is going to get us 2 basics, 1 into our hand and 1 into play tapped. And then when Springbloom Druid enters the battlefield, we sacrifice 1 land to get 2 basics into play tapped. Harrow is somewhat similar, but it's an instant, and it makes us sacrifice 1 land to get 2 basics into play untapped. Again, for a 5-color deck, it's very crucial that we fix our mana, and these can really help us do so. But we also have some what I like to call ramp lords with creatures like Magda Brazen Outlaw and Birchlore Rangers. Magda is a 2/1 dwarf berserker that says other dwarves you control get +1/+0, and whenever a dwarf you control becomes tapped, create a treasure token. On top of that, by sacrificing 5 treasures, we search our library for an artifact or dragon card and put that card onto the battlefield, then shuffle our library. So once we've got Mirror Entity in play, again, we can turn all of our creatures into every creature type. So by doing that and by tapping our creatures, we make treasure tokens because Magda sees them as dwarves. Now, of course, we can utilize those treasures as temporary ramp, or we can sacrifice 5 of them and go get any artifact in our deck, like Maskwood Nexus. And then with that in play, by sacrificing any 5 treasures, we can go get any creature in our deck, because again, all creatures in our deck are all creature types, which includes dragons. So yeah, Magda can be a fantastic card in this deck, especially in combination with another ramp lord like Birchlore Rangers. Birchlore Rangers is a decently old card, so it's got some adjustments to it, so I'm going to read its Oracle text. Basically, it's a 1/1 Elf Druid Ranger, it gained 2 creature types, that says tap 2 untapped elves you control, add 1 mana of any color. So again, with Mirror Entity in play, we can turn all of our creatures into all creature types, including elves. And then we basically just tap any 2 creatures to make 1 mana of any color we need. But next up, we have some even more efficient mana ramp lords than this with Mana Weft Sliver, Gemhide Sliver, and Satan's Crozen Protector. Mana Weft Sliver says, sliver creatures you control have tap, add 1 mana of any color to your mana pool. And then Gemhide Sliver is very similar. It says, all slivers have tap, add 1 mana of any color. So essentially, all of our creatures, again, when we turn them into every creature type, can now tap for 1 mana of any color. So with enough creatures in play, this can ramp us a ton and help us really fix our mana. And then Set and Crow's Protector says, tap an untapped druid you control, add green. Now while unlike our Sliver Lords, this doesn't help us fix our mana, it does allow us to use our mana right away. Because the way this effect is worded, it's allowing our creatures to just tap right away to add that green. So even if those creatures don't have haste, we can utilize them right away to get mana back. But next up, a potentially even better Mana Dork Lord is Sachi, Daughter of Seshiro. This is actually one of my favorite cards to get out in this deck because it helps us in multiple ways. It's a 1/3 Snake Shaman that says other snakes you control get +0/+1, and shamans you control have tap, add green to your mana pool. So again, with a simple Mirror Entity activation, all of our creatures are shamans, and now they tap for 2 mana. But on top of that, and although it might not seem like much, giving other snakes we control +0/+1 can be huge. Anthems in this deck can be very important, because with enough anthems in play, or the right anthems in play, we can activate Mirror Entity without paying any mana. And while that might not seem like a big deal, believe me, it can make a huge impact. So yeah, for multiple reasons, Sachi, Daughter of Seshiro is a fantastic card in this deck. But another great potential Mana Dork Lord is Jiraga Treespeaker. It's a 1/1 that's got level up for 1 and a green, and between levels 1 and 4, it can tap to add green to your mana pool, and once it gets to 5+, it says, elves you control have tap, add green to your mana pool. So just by leveling it up once, it's an effective Mana Dork on its own, but if we get it to 5+, then yeah, this can be a Mana Dork Lord just like Sachi. So once we're set up properly, investing a good amount of mana into this can be very important. But a different kind of Mana Dork Lord is one that works on its own with Herbaz Druid. It's a 0/1 human druid ally that can tap to add X mana of any one color to your mana pool, where X the number of allies you control. So obviously, again, if we get Mirror Entity in play, we can tap this for a lot of mana, basically just the amount of mana equal to the number of creatures that we have. And also keep in mind that because this is already an ally, our commander can actually tutor for this if we really need it. Regardless, there are other Mana Dork Lords out there like this one, like Wirewood Channeler and Elvish Archdruid. Wirewood Channeler is a 2/2 elf druid that can tap to add X mana of any one color, where X the number of elves on the battlefield. And Elvish Archdruid is a 2/2 elf druid that has other elf creatures you control get +1/+1, and it can tap to add green for each elf you control. So Wirewood Channeler can give us a ton of mana and help us fix our mana too, whereas Elvish Archdruid can't fix our mana, but it can still give us a ton of green mana. But again, on top of that, remember that anthems are important in this deck. So it's saying other elf creatures you control get +1/+1 can be very impactful. In combination with another anthem like Sachi's, we can just activate Mirror Entity then for free. Because since they say other, they're not counting themselves, so if we were to activate Mirror Entity for 0, well then Elvish Archdruid would die. But with another anthem to save it, they both survive. So we're also going to be running Canopy Tactician, which isn't exactly a Mana Dork Lord, but it is an Anthem Lord, and it's a Mana Dork, so I included it here, so yeah. Anyways, it's a 3/3 elf warrior that says other elves you control get +1/+1, and it taps to add green. So this can tap for a decent amount of mana, while also again being a very important anthem in this deck. But actually, we still have got some more ways to ramp and some more ways to make these Mana Dorks even more impactful. So we're also going to be running Kyora's Follower, which is a fantastic card in this deck. It's a simple 2/2 merfolk that can tap to untap another target permanent. So first off, this is just another great way to ramp on turn 2 because yeah, this can untap a land if we want. But again, if we've got a Mana Dork in play that can tap for a lot of mana, again like an Elvish Archdruid, then we can just tap it and then untap it and tap it again. And actually this can be even more impactful because we have a decent amount of Lord effects out there that revolve around tapping. So we're also going to be running Vizier of Tumbling Sands, which is somewhat of the exact same thing. It's a 1/3 human cleric that can tap to untap another target permanent, but we can also cycle it for 1 in a blue. And when we do cycle it, we untap target permanent. So if we get it in play, it can obviously really help us out, but if we desperately need to draw a card and untap something right away, we can. And then next up, we've got somewhat of an untapped lord with Scuttling Sliver. Scuttling Sliver says, sliver creatures you control have pay 2, untap this creature. So again, with Mirror Entity, we can just turn all of our creatures into every creature type, including slivers, and now each and every single one of them we can pay to untap. Which, obviously, if we've got a creature that taps for more than 2, allows us to go infinite with that creature. So with, say, Mirror Entity, Scuttling Sliver, and Herbaz Druid in play, well, we've got infinite mana of every color. Yeah, we're just scratching the surface of it, but there's some really nasty things you can do when you can turn all of your creatures into every creature type. Regardless, another fantastic untapped lord in this deck is Mirror Galvanizer. It's a 2/2 mirror that says other mirror creatures you control get +1/+1, so again, keep in mind, Anthem, and also pay 1 and tap to untap each other mirror you control. This simple mirror can provide us an absurd amount of value when it's in play. Just by paying 1, we can untap all of our creatures, and again, if we've got Mandorks in play, that's a lot of extra mana, and again, we've got other lord effects for tapping as well to consider. And this would still be valuable without the Anthem, but with it, its value is off the charts. And speaking of valuable, let's talk about Faces of the Past, which is an enchantment for 2 and a blue. Its Oracle text reads, whenever a creature dies, tap all untapped creatures that share a creature type with it, or untap all tapped creatures that share a creature type with it. This card can help us out in multiple ways, and with the right setup, this can do some really incredible things with this deck. First off, yeah, again with Mirror Entity, by making all of our creatures all creature types, when any creature dies, no matter what it is, we can choose to just untap all of our creatures, because they share a creature type with it. So if an opponent has a vampire die or a dragon die, yeah, all of our creatures untap. And we even have some ways to sacrifice our own creatures so we can actually make this happen whenever we want to. Also, conversely, we can use this in a defensive way too. If one of our creatures dies and it's every single creature type, well, we can just choose to tap down every single creature on the board. So if we know an opponent's going to attack us and we've got a way to sacrifice one of our creatures, well, that might be the right play to just, tap everything down and make it so that they can't attack us. Or we can leave them wide open for another player to hit or for us to hit, and yeah, that can be incredibly impactful. Regardless, now that we've talked about some untapped shenanigans, let's talk about some ways to get to these amazing cards. First up, we've got some draw lords in this deck with Seagate Loremaster, a Zombie Lady of Scrolls, and Crooklaw Elder. Seagate Loremaster is a 1/3 Merfolk Wizard ally, so again, keep in mind, ally Tazri can get it, and it has tap, draw a card for each ally you control. Again, when every single one of our creatures are all creature types, this can just basically tap to draw a card for every single creature we control. And again, if we've got a way to untap this, well, we can draw an absurd amount of cards in a single turn. There are definitely going to be times where you might need to actually grab this first before Mirror Entity as well. If you're in a bind early and you don't have any ways to draw cards, you might actually just want to grab this with Tazri, cast it, and then draw some cards because again, Tazri and this are both allies, and then eventually be able to get Tazri back to your hand or to recast Tazri to actually go get your Mirror Entity. Regardless, a non-ally that can be even more impactful in this deck is a Zombie Lady of Scrolls. A zombie is a 0/2 human wizard that says tap an untapped wizard you control, draw a card. Again, like Sit and Crows and Protector, this has the ability to just say, hey, tap that creature you have right away even if it doesn't have haste. So again, with our creatures being every creature type, including wizards, we can just tap any of them whenever we want to draw a card. Now, a slightly less efficient version of this is Crooklaw Elder, but this can help us out in a different way as well. It's a 3/2 bird wizard with flying that says tap 2 untapped birds you control, draw a card, tap 2 untapped wizards you control, target creature gains flying until end of turn. So obviously when it comes to drawing cards, this one is half as effective as a zombie because again we have to tap 2 creatures instead of 1, but that's still very effective. Regardless, it also has the additional benefit of allowing us to tap 2 creatures to give a creature flying until end of turn. Obviously this can be very impactful for us on defense, or it can help us get a huge creature through on offense. Because keep in mind, we've got a lot of ways to generate a ton of mana in this deck, and yeah, Mirror Entity can make our creatures absolutely massive. So with the right setup, we can easily get one big enough to take out an opponent, and with this, we can actually give it flying to get it through. But next up, we've got some more ways to draw a lot of cards with Jace's Archivist, Mass Appeal, and Airborne Aid. Jace's Archivist is a 2/2 Vidalcan wizard that has pay a blue and tap it. Each player discards their hand and then draws cards equal to the greatest number of cards a player discarded this way. So this one isn't a card advantage lord like our previous ones we've discussed, but this one can draw us a lot of cards in a turn, especially with some untap effects. And by making players discard their hands, we also have some ways to bounce things back to their hands, which we'll get to here in a bit, and that can make a huge impact on the game by just bouncing something back to their hand and then making them get rid of it. But then there's Mass Appeal, which is a sorcery for 2 and a blue that says draw a card for each human you control. So this can be a simple 3-mana spell that can draw us an absurd amount of cards because again, all of our creatures are going to be humans as well. And then Airborne Aid is somewhat similar. It's a sorcery for 1 more and it says draw a card for each bird in play. So though this card does cost 1 more than Mass Appeal, technically it can draw us more cards because it's counting every single bird in play, not just our own. So if an opponent happens to have a bunch of bird tokens in play, which has happened to me before, you actually draw some extra cards, which is nice to have. Regardless, we're also going to be running a draw spell without a restriction with Shamanic Revelation. This one's just going to straight up draw a card for each creature we control, and it's got Ferocious. You gain 4 life for each creature you control with power 4 or greater. Again, Mirror Entity can very easily change the base power and toughness of all of our creatures. So by making all of our creatures into 4/4s, we cast this and draw an absurd amount of cards and gain an absurd amount of life. Next up, we've got another draw spell that can help us out in a different way. Read the Runes is an instant for X and a blue, and it says draw X cards for each card drawn this way, discard unless you sacrifice a permanent. So in a way, this can just be a giant loot spell to help us draw a ton of cards, and then have to discard a bunch of cards but still get the right cards into our hand. But also, because we can actually sacrifice a permanent instead of discarding a card, this can help us out with our commander and Mirror Entity. First off, if we want to utilize our commander to go tutor for another ally, we can use this to sacrifice our commander while drawing a card. So we can put our commander back in the command zone to recast it for that ETB. Also, because Mirror Entity is such a huge piece of this deck, if someone is trying to exile it, that's not going to be too good for us. So by utilizing this, we can sacrifice it so it doesn't get exiled, and then we can get it back from our graveyard in multiple ways. And actually, I probably should have mentioned this earlier, but if you're incredibly desperate and you don't have anthems in play, you can activate Mirror Entity for 0 and just blow up your entire board. So yeah, there's a way to get around that too, though this is much more clean and a way to keep the rest of your board intact. Regardless, one of those ways to get Mirror Entity back from your graveyard is with Graveshifter. Graveshifter is a 2/2 shapeshifter with changeling, so again, it's every creature type, including ally, so our commander can go get it, and it says, when it enters the battlefield, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. But next up, we also have some Sliver Lords that can help us out in different ways with Hollowhead Sliver and Homing Sliver. Hollowhead Sliver says, Sliver creatures you control have tap, discard a card, draw a card. So this basically just gives all of our creatures Rummage. And while rummaging isn't card advantage, it is card selection. So this can help us ditch dead cards in our hand for potentially better cards off the top. And then Homing Sliver can actually be really incredible in this deck. It's a 2/2 Sliver that says each Sliver card in each player's hand has Sliver Cycling for 3, and it's got Sliver Cycling for 3 itself. That means that you can pay 3 and discard this card, insert your library for a Sliver card, reveal it, put in your hand, then shuffle your library. So first up, outside of our commander, this is another way that we can actually tutor for Mirror Entity. Or if we already have Mirror Entity, we can tutor for one of our Mana-doric lords like, Mana Web Sliver and get that into play, and now we've got a ton of mana. And actually, if we get this in play with Maskwood Nexus, things get really out of hand. Because every single creature, no matter where they're at in our deck and on the field, are slivers. So with any creature in our hand, we can pay 3 and discard them to tutor for any other creature in our deck. So yeah, that's pretty absurd, and there's some pretty easy ways to win from there. Regardless, we're running some other tutors in this deck with Mythos of Brokos, Bring to Light, and Coveted Prize, which can each help us out in different ways. Mythos of Brokos is a sorcery for 2 green, but it says, if blue and black were spent to cast this spell, search your library for a card, put that card in your graveyard, then shuffle your library. Return up to 2 permanent cards from your graveyard to your hand. So essentially this can tutor for Mirror Entity, or more importantly Maskwood Nexus, get it into our graveyard, and then get it back into our hand with something else. And then a different kind of tutor is Bring to Light. It's a sorcery for 3 green, and it has Converge. Search your library for a creature, instant, or sorcery card with converted mana cost less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast Bring to Light. Exile that card, then shuffle your library. You may cast that card without paying its mana cost. So essentially if we pay every color of mana to cast this spell, we can go get any creature, instant, or sorcery that costs 5 or less and cast it for free. So obviously there's a lot of ways that this card can be impactful, and yes, you can go get Mirror Entity if we need it. But Coveted Prize might just be the best tutor in this deck. It's a sorcery for 4 and a black, and it's going to cost 1 less to cast for each creature in our party. So if we have a cleric, a rogue, a warrior, and a wizard in play, this just costs a black mana. It says, search your library for a card, put it into your hand, then shuffle your library. If you have a full party, you may cast a spell with converted mana cost 4 or less from your hand without paying its mana cost. Basically, again, with a Mirror Entity activation and 3 other creatures in play, we meet that requirement for a full party. So this is a 1 mana tutor that goes and gets us any card in our library, and then we can cast a card with converted mana cost 4 or less for free. That's really incredible. So if we've got Mirror Entity in play, if we really want to, we can go get Maskwood Nexus and just get it straight into play. Obviously, that's kind of doubling up on its effect, but again, as I mentioned before, Maskwood Nexus can help us out in some different ways. Regardless, once we're set up properly and we cast this, or pretty much any of these, we can go get a key piece to win. But now let's move on and talk about some other key pieces in this deck and some really impactful lords. First up, let's talk about Lullmage Mentor, a 2/2 Merfolk Wizard for 1 blue that says, whenever a spell or an ability you control counters a spell, you may put a 1/1 blue Merfolk creature token onto the battlefield. And of course, by tapping 7 untapped merfolk you control, you counter target spell. So basically in this deck, this is, hey, tap 7 creatures, counter a spell, and make a merfolk token. So yeah, this can be incredibly impactful, especially with some of those mass untap effects, which can also be very impactful with Captivating Vampire. It's a 2/2 vampire that costs 1 black, and it says other vampire creatures you control get ++1. On top of that, it says tap 5 untapped vampires you control, gain control of target creature, becomes a vampire in addition to its other types. So first up, yep, another Anthem on a creature, and we already talked about why that can be incredibly impactful with Mere Entity. But again, what truly makes this card great in this deck is the ability to just gain control of our opponent's creatures and then use those creatures to gain control of more of our opponent's creatures. With this, we can easily take over the game and dominate our opponents with their best creatures. And again, with a mass untap effect, we can make that happen in absolutely no time. But then there's Academia Cultist, which helps us gain control of our opponent's creatures in a different way. It's a 0/2 human shaman ally that has tap, put target creature card from an opponent's graveyard onto the battlefield under your control if its converted mana cost is less than or equal to the number of allies you control. So again, keep in mind this is an ally, so our commander can go get it if needed. But yeah, this repeatable reanimator can get some massive creatures out of our opponent's graveyards, and again with an untap effect, it can be even more impactful. So yeah, now your opponent's creature's deaths can easily benefit you. And speaking of deaths benefiting you, let's talk about Hofri Ghostforge, Zathra Necromancer, and Atla Palani Nest Tender. Hofri Ghostforge is an incredible card in this deck. It's a 4/5 Dwarf Cleric that says spirits you control get +1/+1 and have Trample and Haste. First off, I just want to point out that this is the first example of an Anthem that we've seen that applies to all of our creatures. It doesn't say other, which obviously is because Hofri is not a spirit itself, but again in this deck, it is. So essentially an Anthem like this one doesn't require you to have another Anthem because there's no word other. So you can activate Mere Entity for free to your heart's content. You know, on top of giving all of your creatures Trample and Haste, both of which are incredibly relevant in this deck. By making your creatures huge with your commander, you can get a ton of damage through with this. And of course, thanks to that haste, you can swing with your creatures right away, and you can also tap all those creatures right away that have tap abilities. Regardless, the next part is incredibly impactful as well. It says whenever another non-token creature you control dies, exile it. If you do, create a token that's a copy of that creature, except it's a spirit in addition to its other types, and it has, when this creature leaves the battlefield, return the exile card to your graveyard. Basically, this kind of gives our creatures a second life. So if a creature is dealt with, well, we just kind of get a copy of it back. That is really incredible, especially in combination with something like a Sacrifice Outlet, where we can, utilize a creature's tap ability, sacrifice them, and then utilize it again. And speaking of sacrificing creatures for value, let's talk about Zathra Necromancer. It says whenever it or another human creature you control dies, create a tapped 2/2 black zombie creature token. Again, every single one of our creatures, thanks to Mere Entity, is gonna be a human. So now when any of our creatures die, we get a 2/2 to help replace them. And actually, if we can keep activating Mere Entity for free, again with an Anthem like Hofri's, well, if we can just keep sacrificing those zombies, which are now also humans, we can do this infinitely. And we'll talk about some ways to win from there. But actually, now that I think about it, one way to win from there is with Atla Palani in play as well. Atla Palani is a 2/3 human shaman that has pay 2 and tap, create a 0/1 green egg creature token with Defender. And whenever an egg you control dies, reveal cards from the top of your library until you reveal a creature card, put that card onto the battlefield and the rest of the bottom of your library in a random order. Basically, with this in play in Mere Entity, whenever any of our creatures die, since they're eggs, we get another creature off the top for free. So with the right Anthem and a free Sacrifice Outlet in play, we can just keep activating Mere Entity and then sacrificing another egg, and then another egg, and then another egg. Essentially, we can keep churning through our deck and get the right creatures in play, or again, in combination with Zathra Necromancer, we can just sacrifice all those zombie tokens, which are also eggs, to get every single creature from our deck in play. And yeah, when that happens, we win. Regardless, outside of getting value from when our creatures die, we also have ways to prevent them from dying too. And two fantastic ways come with Linvala, Shield of Seagate, and Etchings of the Chosen. Linvala is a 3/3 Angel Wizard with flying that has at the beginning of combat on your turn, if you have a full party, choose target non-land permanent an opponent controls. Until your next turn, it can't attack or block, and its activated abilities can't be activated. And by sacrificing Linvala, we choose Hexproof or Indestructible, and creatures we control gain that ability until end of turn. So first up, again with Mere Entity, it's incredibly easy for us to get a full party with this deck. So with this, we can lock down an opponent's best non-land permanent. And then when we need to protect our team, we can sacrifice this and then give all of our creatures Hexproof or Indestructible until end of turn. Another way to protect them, though, is with Etchings of the Chosen. When it enters the battlefield, we choose a creature type, and creatures we control of the chosen type get +1/+1. On top of that, by paying 1 and sacrificing a creature of the chosen type, target creature we control gains indestructible until end of turn. So, first up, again with Mirror Entity, this is an anthem that just works on its own. We don't need another anthem. So we can activate Mirror Entity as many times as we want, and all of our creatures are whatever type we chose when this came into play. So then with this, we can just pay 1, sacrifice one of our lesser creatures to save one of our more important creatures again, like Mirror Entity. And keep in mind that this, of course, can work fantastically with Atla Palani, Zathra Necromancer, and Faces of the Past because it's a sacrifice outlet. Regardless, some other ways to protect our team come with Sigarda, Huron's Grace, Drog Skull Captain, and Lord of the Unreal. Sigarda is a 4/5 Angel of Flying that says you and humans you control have hexproof. And by paying 2, we can exile a card from our graveyard to put a 1/1 white human soldier creature token onto the battlefield. This card can have an incredible impact on the game. Because again with Mirror Entity, all of our creatures, including this, are humans, so yeah, now they all have hexproof. On top of that, we have hexproof, and we can also start exiling cards from our graveyard to make 1/1 tokens. And again, like I mentioned before, just adding more and more bodies to the field can be incredibly impactful. Again, that can help with our Mana Dork Lords or our Draw Lords, etc, etc. There are plenty of cards in this deck that just care about having more creatures in play because again, we can make them whatever type we want so we can tap them for their effect. Regardless, then there's Drog Skull Captain, which helps out in a similar yet different way. It's a 2/2 Spirit Soldier with flying that says other spirit creatures you control get +1/+1 and have hexproof. So keep in mind that this is one of those other anthems in which we need a secondary anthem to help us out, but still. This gives all of our other creatures +1/+1 and hexproof, and that's huge. But one anthem that isn't another anthem that's incredibly impactful is the 2/2 Human Wizard, Lord of the Unreal. It says illusion creatures you control get +1/+1 and have hexproof. So again, this one doesn't say other, so it also counts itself when Mirror Entity turns it into an illusion. Which again, thanks to that broad anthem effect, Mirror Entity can do for free. And speaking of those broad anthems that affect all of your creatures, we have other creatures that can help with that with Biowaste Blob, Master Splicer, and Deep Forest Hermit. Biowaste Blob is a 0/0 ooze that says oozes you control get +1/+1. It also says at the beginning of your upkeep, if you control a commander, create a token that's a copy of Biowaste Blob. So again, first up, this is a broad anthem that helps out Mirror Entity, but yeah, this is a creature that can essentially keep splitting over and over and over again, giving you more copies of it. So this can not only pump our creatures further and further and further, but more importantly, gives us more bodies on the field. And speaking of bodies on the field, there's Master Splicer, a 1/3 Human Artificer that has, when it enters the battlefield, create a 3/3 colorless golem artifact creature token, and golems you control get +1/+1. So again, a broad anthem effect and 2 bodies, yeah, sign me up. And you can definitely sign me up for Deep Forest Hermit, a 1/1 Elf Druid with Vanishing for 3, and when it enters the battlefield, you get 4 1/1 green squirrel creature tokens, and squirrels you control get +1/+1. So yeah, for 5 mana, we get 5 bodies and a broad anthem effect. Now, it does have Vanishing 3, so at some point we will lose this, but we're most likely going to finish off our opponents before then. And we actually have some ways to get even more bodies on the field with some additional effects with Scampering Scorcher, March Flitter, and Slinging Lieutenant. Scampering Scorcher is just a 1/1 elemental, but when it comes into play, we create 2 1/1 elemental creature tokens, and elementals we control gain haste until end of turn. So this gives us 3 bodies and can give all of our creatures haste until end of turn, which again can be incredible in this deck. And then there's Marsh Flitter, which is a 1/1 with flying, and when it enters the battlefield, we get 2 1/1 Black Goblin Rogue creature tokens. It also has Sacrifice a Goblin. Marsh Flitter has base power and toughness 3/3 until end of turn. So this gives us 3 bodies for 4 mana as well, but on top of that, this is a free sacrifice outlet, which again can easily help us win the game if we're set up properly. But an even better card in this deck has got to be Slinging Lieutenant. It's a 1/1 goblin that says when it enters the battlefield, create 2 1/1 red goblin creature tokens, and by sacrificing a goblin, target player loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This card might not seem like much, but it is absolutely incredible in this deck when you're set up in the right way. Zathra Necromancer plus this plus a free Mirror Entity activation equals game over for all of your opponents, because you can essentially just keep sacrificing and making zombie goblins to drain everyone out. Regardless, you usually don't even need that though to finish your opponents off. This is just an incredible card in this deck. But now that we talked about setting ourselves up to win, let's talk about some more cards that can help throw a wrench into our opponent's plans. First up, there's an absolutely incredible lord in this deck with Galecaster Colossus. It's a 5/6 giant wizard that says, tap an untapped wizard you control, return target non-land permanent you don't control to its owner's hand. So this is kind of like a zombie, but instead of drawing cards, you're bouncing things. And again, by making all of your creatures into wizards, you can bounce pretty much whatever you need to bounce. So if something's problematic in play, get rid of it. But yeah, right before your turn, you basically just, tap all of your untapped wizards that you control, basically your entire board, bounce a lot of things, and then on your turn, maybe just do it again to get rid of everything else. Or if you've got a mass untap effect, it gets even quicker. We also have some smaller but still very effective effects in this deck with Reclamation Sage, Mass Vandal, and Oblation. Reclamation Sage says when it enters the battlefield, you may destroy target artifact or enchantment. And again, since this effect comes on a body, that's most definitely not a bad thing for this deck. Speaking of which, Mass Vandal is a 1/3 changeling, so yeah, that can be relevant in a lot of scenarios, and it says when it enters the battlefield, you may exile a creature card from your graveyard. If you do, exile target artifact or enchantment opponent controls. Next up, there's Oblation, which is an instant for 2 and a white, and it says the owner of target non-land permanent shuffles into their library, then draws 2 cards. So most of the time, yes, we probably will use this on our opponent's things, but in a sneaky way, we can actually use this on one of our own things to either draw some cards or to draw some cards and save something. Again, if someone's trying to exile a key piece like Mirror Entity, we can just, shuffle it away, draw some cards, and get it back later with our commander. But then we've also got some bigger removal effects with things like Aether Gale, Whelming Wave, and Realm Cloak Giant. Aether Gale is going to bounce 6 target non-land permanents back to their owner's hands. So keep in mind that we can actually bounce some of our own things if that's going to help us as well with any ETBs or other things, etc, etc. And then Whelming Wave can be a one-sided board wipe for us for just 4 mana. It says return all creatures to their owner's hands except for Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. Again, thanks to Mirror Entity, well, all of our creatures are Krakens, Leviathans, Octopuses, and Serpents. And speaking of one-sided board wipes, there's Realm Cloak Giant, which is a 7/7 giant with Vigilance, but it also has Cast Off an adventure for 3 white. And that adventure says destroy all non-giant creatures, which again, our creatures are giants, so goodbye opponent's creatures. Regardless, now that we've gone through every single non-land card in this deck, it's time for us to tackle the lands. First up, we've got Command Tower, which can tap for any of our colors, Exotic Orchard, which can tap for any of our colors most of the time, and Path of Ancestry, which enters the battlefield tapped and can tap for any of our colors. And on top of that, whenever that mana is spent to cast a creature spell that shares a creature type with our commander, we scry 1. So keep in mind if we've got Maskwood Nexus in play, that's every one of our creatures. But next up is perhaps the most impactful land in this deck with the World Tree. It enters the battlefield tapped and it can tap for a green, and it says as long as you control 6 or more lands, lands you control have tap add 1 mana of any color. So first up, this is some really easy and some incredible perfect mana fixing for this deck, and yeah, as a 5-color deck, you're gonna need a good amount of mana fixing. But on top of that, this can be a win condition for this deck as well. By paying white, blue, black, red, and green, or in other words, double Wooburg, we can tap and sacrifice the World Tree. When we do, we search our library for any number of God cards, put them onto the battlefield, then shuffle our library. So first up, yes, this can go get all of our changelings from our deck and get them into play. But if we've got Maskwood Nexus in play, this gets every single creature from our deck directly into play, and yeah, we win from there. So this land can help us perfectly fix our mana and also be a win condition, which is just absolutely incredible. And then we've got Evolving Wilds and Terramorphic Expanse, both of which we can tap and sacrifice to get a basic land from our library into play tapped. And then next up, there's Ash Barrens, which can tap for our colors, and it's got basic land cycling for 1, so we can pay 1, discard it, and go get any basic land and put it into our hand. But next up, we're going to be running some Panoramas with Bant, Naya, and Jund. Each can tap for a color, so we can pay 1 and tap and sacrifice them for 1 of 3 lands. Bant gets us a forest, plains, or island, Naya gets us a mountain, forest, or plains, and Jund gets us a swamp, mountain, or forest. When it comes to lands in this deck, I focused on ones that could either get forest or tap for green for the most part because, yeah, most of our mana ramp is in green, and we really want to make sure that we can actually ramp and fix our mana properly. But we also have some lands that can actually help ramp us too with Crozen Verge, Mirrored Landscape, and Blighted Woodland. Crozen Verge enters battlefield tapped, taps for a color, so we can pay 2 and tap and sacrifice Crozen Verge to go get a forest or a plains into play tapped. And then Mirrored Landscape is nearly the exact same thing, but when we sacrifice it, we get 2 basic lands that share a land type and put them into play tapped. And then by sacrificing Blighted Woodland, we can get any 2 basics and get them into play tapped. Next up, we're going to be running each of the Vivid lands with Vivid Grove, Vivid Creek, and Vivid Meadow, which come into play tapped with 2 charge counters on them. They each can tap for 1 color, or we can tap and remove a charge counter from them to add 1 mana of any color. So to round out the 5 Vivid lands, we're also going to be running, of course, Vivid Crag and Vivid Marsh. Vivid Crag taps for a red, and Vivid Marsh taps for a black. And then we're going to be running some Tri-lands with Seaside Citadel, Opulent Palace, and Sandstep Citadel. Each come into play tapped, and Seaside taps for Bant colors, Opulent taps for Saltai, and Sandstep Citadel taps for Abzan. We've also got Frontier Bivouac and Jungle Shrine, which do the same, but Frontier taps for Temur colors, and Jungle Shrine taps for Naya. And finally, we're going to be rounding out this deck with some basic lands, including 5 forests, 3 islands, and 2 plains. And then finally, the last 2 lands that we're going to be talking about are Mountain and Swamps, and we're going to be running 1 mountain and 2 swamps. But now that we've talked about every single card in this deck, let's talk about the price. Like I said before, this is my pet deck, and I have been working on this deck for quite some time, so prices have fluctuated since the deck started. And like I've said before, I've also been utilizing cards in my collection that might have been budget at one point, but might not be anymore. Regardless, the current estimated cost of this deck is $89.94. And yes, there's a card here or there that you could cut, like maybe Captivating Vampire, to save some cost in there. Regardless, also keep in mind that this is not taking into account any heavily played or damaged cards in your optimization. On top of that, this is also counting basic lands at 10 cents a piece. But also keep in mind that this does not include shipping, which might vary depending on your location. Regardless, I've really been enjoying this deck, and I finally feel like it's in the right spot to share it with you. This is definitely going to be a deck that keeps adjusting as time goes on. And to be honest, I'm incredibly excited about some upcoming sets that could really help this deck out. I mean, just around the corner, we've got a vampire-specific set and a werewolf-specific set in Innistrad. So yeah, we very much could get some more tribal lords to really help this deck out. And with that, the show has come to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you, so make sure you comment below and let me know what your thoughts on this episode are, and as always, thanks again and have a good one.